Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Minash. Yesterday's inflation report delivered a surprise. Headline prices fell pretty sharply, but the important story lies beneath the headline. This was not a gasoline story. Core inflation was unchanged for the month, and several categories that have kept inflation stubbornly high actually moved lower. For investors, that distinction matters because it changes the conversation around today's interest rates. Let's be precise about the data. The new report is the Consumer Price Index, not the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index that the Federal Reserve prefers. That PCE report still showed elevated inflation, but the CPI components give us a preview of where price pressure may be heading. Core CPI came in flat compared with expectations for an increase. Core goods declined, for example, medical services, transportation services, used vehicles, automobile insurance. They all showed softness. These are signs of broader disinflation, not just cheaper oil. Danielle DiMartino Booth, someone who I follow closely, former Federal Reserve insider from the Dallas Fed, made the point in discussion following Chairman Kevin Warsh's testimony before Congress. She noted that traders had been positioned for a hotter core reading. Instead, they received the opposite. She also highlighted weakness in areas like insurance, hotels, healthcare, used vehicles, and core goods. Her conclusion was that the restrictive policy is working through the economy but with a lag. But she also included a warning that disinflation can emerge because businesses are losing pricing power. When companies can't pass input cost onto customers, they compress margins. Management teams respond by cutting expenses, delaying investment, reducing hiring, and eliminating jobs. That's why a benign inflation print can carry a less benign message about demand. Lower inflation is good for purchasing power and financing costs, but if inflation is falling because households are pulling back and companies are defending margins, then the economy could be quite a bit weaker than the headline suggests. That same medicine that cools prices also cools economic activity. Chairman Warsh told Congress that getting monetary policy right is the Fed's objective, and the 5-year inflation surge can be put in the past. That language is not particularly hawkish, it reflects accountability. But he also said the monthly numbers are noisy and longer-term inflation is largely determined by monetary policy. In other words, the Fed is unlikely to declare victory based on one report. So the near-term outcome is likely patience, with policy held somewhat restrictive while officials watch the data and assess the risks. For real estate, the question is not whether the Fed cuts at the next meeting in July, it's what happens to the 10-year Treasury yield and the credit spreads. Mortgage rates, construction loans, bridge debt financing are mostly shaped by the long end of the curve, by lender appetite and the perception of risk. Softer core inflation can reduce pressure on Treasury yields. But if oil rises, if deficits remain large, or credit losses spread, the bond market may not cooperate. The Fed, of course, controls the overnight lending rates, not all the borrowing costs directly. But still, the bond market does pay attention to the Fed because there is a link between both the short and long-term rates. So the question is, what lower inflation says about rents and operating income? Shelter inflation is absolutely cooling, and that is welcome from a policy standpoint because shelter makes up a very large component of both CPI and core PCE. It makes up 40% of core PCE. Owners need to distinguish between slower rent growth and rent declines. In apartment markets, especially in the South, concessions are doing the work. Rents are actually dropping in many markets. A property can report stable asking rents while in fact giving away 6 weeks of free rent. The effective rent is lower even if the number looks unchanged. So you want to underwrite to the cash flow, not just the advertised rent. The third question is credit. Danielle pointed to rising bankruptcies, tighter lending standards, and stress not fully reflected in public markets. See, markets can appear calm while borrowers are struggling. Real estate investors should assume refinancing remains selective. Strong sponsors, conservative leverage, liquidity, and business plans will continue to receive capital, and marginal deals probably not. A lower inflation print does not repair a weak capital stack. It doesn't create debt service coverage or replace reserves or solve a maturity problem. So how should you respond? Don't rush out and make an acquisition because the inflation report surprised you. Don't assume that rate cuts will rescue a leveraged deal. Instead, update the underwriting. Run a lower rate case, a slower rent growth case, a longer lease-up case, and a credit case. Ask what happens if cap rates do not compress. Ask what happens if the exit is delayed by a year. Favorable inflation news should improve optionality, but they shouldn't justify weaker discipline. As always, Capital preservation comes first. And the takeaway is simple. The report is encouraging because the improvement reached beyond energy and into some of the core categories of the CPI. Falling inflation may bring the Fed closer to easing interest rates, while at the same time revealing weaker demand, tighter margins, and stress in the credit markets. So for real estate investors, I wouldn't celebrate or be fearful. It's time to pay close attention. Watch the rents, pay close attention to lender behavior, the credit spreads, and employment, and then structure every deal to survive being early, being wrong, or for things taking longer to get to safety. As you think about that, have an awesome rest of your day. Go make some great things happen. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.